The screen in front of me turned red before anyone said a word, and that color told me everything I needed to know. 300 delegates sat in the round chamber of the Galactic Concord, and every one of them was looking at me. My name is Daniel Ford, and I had spent 6 years representing humanity in this hall, and in one single moment, all of that work folded into a single verdict. Exile. The word did not need to be spoken aloud. It hung there in glowing letters above the central dais, translated into every language present, and my own translator whispered it into my ear in a calm, polite voice, as if it were reading out the weather. I did not stand up. I did not argue. My hands stayed flat on the table in front of me, and I made myself breathe slowly, because the entire chamber was watching to see what a human would do when told he was no longer wanted. Counselor Vex, a tall being with silver skin and eyes like still water, rose from the high seat and read the official reasoning. Humanity, she said, showed a pattern of destabilizing behavior. Humanity ignored risk calculations. Humanity intervened in situations where the numbers clearly advised against it. Humanity had, on 11 separate occasions across the last decade, chosen to save individuals when the official cost of that choice exceeded the acceptable loss threshold set by Concord law. In simple words, we cared too much, and we did not stop when we were told to stop. I remember looking around the chamber at the other delegates. Some of them would not meet my eyes. A few looked almost sorry, in whatever way their faces could show sorrow. Counselor Vex was not one of them. Her face stayed still, the way a judge's face stays still when reading a sentence that has already been decided long before the trial began. "The vote stands," she said. "Humanity and all its territories are to withdraw from Concord space within 30 standard days. All personnel currently serving in Concord stations, outposts, and vessels are to be recalled. This is not a punishment. This is a correction." A correction. I turned that word over in my mind long after the session ended, because it was such a careful, bloodless way to describe what was happening. We were not being punished, they said. We were simply being removed, the way a doctor removes a splinter, quick and clean, so the wound could heal properly. I thanked the assembly for their time. That was all I said. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood, in that moment, that anything I said would be recorded, studied, and used as proof that humans were emotional, unpredictable, difficult to manage. So I gave them silence instead. I gave them the one thing they always claimed we lacked, and I watched several delegates blink in confusion, as if they had expected shouting and did not know what to do with quiet. Outside the chamber, my assistant, a young woman named Laura Bennett, was waiting for me in the long glass corridor that overlooked half the station. She had been listening on the internal feed, and her face already had the answer before I said a word. "They actually did it," she said. "Not a question. A statement, delivered flat, the way you say something you already knew was coming, but hoped would not." 30 days, I told her. "We need to start the recall now." She nodded, and to her credit, she did not waste time with disbelief. She pulled up her tablet and began drafting the first message before we had even reached the elevator. That was the thing about humans that the Concord never seemed to understand. We could feel the full weight of a moment and still move our hands to do the next necessary task. Grief and duty were never enemies to us. They walked side by side. As the elevator descended through the station, I thought about all the places our people were scattered across Concord space. Repair crews on mining platforms nobody else wanted to work on, because the gravity fields there gave most other species terrible sickness. Medical volunteers on quarantine ships, sitting for months at a time with patients from species that considered isolation a form of suffering worse than the illness itself, simply because a human could sit there and hold a claw, or a limb, or whatever passed for a hand, and not flinch away. Listening post volunteers on the edge of contested space, watching the dark for threats that the Concord's automated systems were not built to notice, because our engineers had learned, the hard way, that machines missed things that instinct caught. None of these jobs were glamorous. None of them came with medals or high pay. Most of the Concorde species considered these positions beneath them, tedious, or simply too uncomfortable. We took them because somebody had to, and because doing hard, quiet work without complaint was something we were good at. All of that ended today. By the time we reached the transport bay, word of the vote had already spread through the human quarter of the station. I expected anger. I expected someone to raise their voice, to demand answers, to march back into that chamber and refuse to accept the ruling. Instead, I found something else entirely. I found people packing. Engineers were folding up toolkits they had built with their own hands over years of service. Medical staff were writing careful handover notes for whichever alien crew would inherit their patients, explaining, in painstaking detail, which treatments worked and which the manuals got wrong. A young man named Peter Voss, who had spent 4 years maintaining the station's life support systems almost single-handedly, was leaving behind a folder of hand-corrected schematics, showing every place the original alien blueprints had been slightly off, every fix he had made that nobody had ever asked him to make. I found Grace Hall, one of our senior engineers, sitting at a workbench with a cup of something that had long gone cold beside her. She was writing out, by hand, a full log of every safety override she had installed over the years, the small, unofficial adjustments that were never approved by Concorde regulation, but had quietly prevented at least 3 serious accidents that I knew of. "They're not going to use half of this," she said, without looking up. "They'll follow the official manual instead. It's cleaner, easier to justify." "Then why write it?" I asked her. She finally looked up at me, and there was no anger in her eyes, only a kind of tired patience. "Because if I don't, and something goes wrong later, I want it written down somewhere that we tried to warn them, even if nobody reads it." That was the moment I understood what kind of exit we were going to make. Not a loud one, not a bitter one. We were going to leave everything better than the numbers required, exactly the way we always had, and we were going to do it quietly, because that was who we were, whether the Concorde wanted us or not. Word came from Central Command 2 days later. The full recall order had been issued, timelines confirmed, transport ships assigned. I read through the official documentation twice, checking for any sign of protest buried somewhere in the bureaucratic language, some hidden clause demanding compensation or apology. There was none. Humanity's leadership had accepted the ruling exactly as delivered, and had simply begun the work of leaving. I called my counterpart back home, an older diplomat named Henry Marsh, who had helped negotiate our very first treaty with the Concorde decades earlier. I asked him directly if there was any plan to appeal, any final effort being organized behind closed doors. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "No," he said, "we're not going to beg to stay somewhere that made it this clear we're not wanted. But Daniel, listen to me. We are not leaving quietly because we're weak, or because we don't care. We're leaving quietly because that's exactly the kind of thing they'll remember, long after the shouting would have faded." I did not fully understand what he meant that day. I would understand it much better in the weeks that followed. On the final morning before the human quarter of the station fell silent, I walked through the corridors one last time. The lights were still on in every section, exactly as they always had been. The environmental system still ran at the careful, slightly adjusted settings our engineers had tuned over years of small corrections. Every terminal held updated logs, every workstation held clear notes, every piece of equipment had been left in better condition than we found it. At the transport bay, a small crowd had gathered, not to protest, not to make speeches, but simply to help each other load the last of the personal belongings onto the waiting ships. There was very little talking. There was a strange kind of calm in the air, the calm of people who had already made peace with a decision that was never truly theirs to make, and had decided instead to control the one thing that was theirs, which was how they chose to leave. Counselor Vex arrived at the bay just as the last of the crates were being secured. I do not know if she came out of official duty or something closer to curiosity. She stood a short distance away, watching the quiet efficiency of it all, the complete absence of any scene, any outburst, any of the drama she had clearly expected from a species she had just voted to remove. She approached me as I stood near the boarding ramp. "I expected anger," she said. "I know," I told her. "This is not what I expected instead." I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought about everything I could have said. I thought about listing every job we had quietly filled that no one else wanted. I thought about naming every life saved by a choice the Concord's own calculations had called unacceptable. I thought about telling her exactly what her assembly was about to lose and how long it would take them to notice. Instead, I said only one sentence, because I understood, by then, that it would say more than any argument ever could. "We'll leave the lights on the way we found them." Then I turned, walked up the ramp, and did not look back. Behind me, the doors sealed with a soft, ordinary sound, no different from any other day. Within the hour, the last human transport undocked from the station, sliding away into the dark, without ceremony, without protest, without a single voice raised in anger. The silence we left behind was so complete that, for a long while, many in the Concorde mistook it for peace. They would not make that mistake for long. The corridors of the station felt different within hours of our departure, though I was no longer there to see it myself. I heard about it later, from old friends who stayed in contact through unofficial channels. Small messages passed quietly between people who were not supposed to still be speaking to each other. They told me the human quarter, once full of quiet movement, careful maintenance, low voices working through the night shift, had gone completely still. No hum of extra fans installed to cool overworked systems. No small handwritten notes taped beside control panels warning of quirks the official manuals never mentioned. Just clean, official silence, exactly as regulation intended. For the first few days, I heard, several Concorde officials expressed something close to relief. One administrator was quoted in an internal report saying that operations finally felt predictable, orderly, free of the constant small deviations humans always seem to introduce into every system they touch. Efficiency reports briefly ticked upward, since removing our unofficial overrides and manual adjustments simplified certain automated processes. It did not occur to them yet that some of those overrides existed precisely because the automated processes were flawed, and the small deviations they were so relieved to lose had been quietly saving them from consequences they had never had to face. I thought of Grace Hall's careful handwritten log, sitting unread in some archive drawer. I thought of Peter Voss's corrected schematics, filed away and likely ignored in favor of the original, slightly wrong blueprints. I thought of every small fix, every quiet warning, every extra hour spent by human hands making sure a system worked better than it was designed to. None of that would matter yet. Not for a while, but absence has a strange way of making itself known, slowly at first, and then all at once. I settled back on Earth within the first 2 weeks of our full withdrawal, though settled is a generous word for what actually happened. Every human who had served across Concorde space arrived home to a world that did not know quite what to do with us. We were not defeated soldiers. We were not refugees. We were simply people who had been asked to leave and had left, and now had to figure out what came next. Henry Marsh called a meeting of every senior human official who had served in Concorde territory, myself included. We gathered in a plain conference room outside the Capitol, no cameras, no press, just tired people trying to make sense of an ending none of us had chosen. Laura Bennett sat beside me, still carrying the same tablet she had used to draft recall notices 2 weeks earlier, though now it held something different, a growing collection of messages from old contacts still inside Concorde space. "They're already noticing small things," she told the room, scrolling through her notes. "Nothing serious yet, but things are slower. Systems are running exactly as designed, which sounds fine, until you remember how many of our people spent years quietly working around designs that were never quite right." Henry listened without interrupting, the way he always did, letting people finish their thoughts before he spoke. When Laura finished, he nodded slowly. "We are not going back to fix their designs," he said. That decision is not ours to make. What we can do is make sure that when they come asking, and they will come asking eventually, we have not lost what made us useful in the first place. I did not fully understand what he meant that day, but in the weeks that followed, I began to see the shape of it. Word came through the same quiet channels a few days later, from an old friend named Ellen Cross, a communications officer who had worked alongside me on the Outer Ring Station for nearly 3 years before the exile. She had chosen to stay in contact with a handful of trusted Concord colleagues, mostly for the simple reason that friendship does not end just because politics demands it. She sent me a message describing a minor incident on the same station where I had once served. A cooling system on one of the lower decks had begun running slightly hot, nothing dangerous according to official readings, well within acceptable parameters. Under the old arrangement, one of our engineers would have noticed the small temperature creep days before it reached even the lowest edge of acceptable range, because human maintenance staff had always checked those readings manually, out of habit, rather than relying entirely on automated alerts. The automated system, this time, waited until the numbers crossed the official threshold before flagging anything at all, which meant the problem had already grown larger than it needed to be by the time anyone addressed it. It was fixed. Nobody was harmed, but it took 3 times as long to resolve as it would have under the old system, and the resulting downtime disrupted operations across 2 connected sections of the station for the better part of a day. Small numbers on a report. Nothing more than that, on paper, but I understood immediately what it meant, because I had walked those corridors myself, and I knew exactly which human engineer used to catch problems like that long before the official systems ever noticed them. I thought of Peter Voss again, and the folder of corrected schematics he had left behind. I wondered if anyone had even opened it. Over the following weeks, similar small stories reached me, each one passed along quietly, unofficially, friend to friend, rather than through any formal channel. A medical shuttle carrying patients between stations experienced a communication delay that would once have been caught and corrected by a human dispatcher who insisted on double-checking every handoff by voice, rather than trusting the automated relay alone. A trade negotiation between 2 smaller Concord member species nearly collapsed over a translation misunderstanding that a human mediator would have caught within minutes, simply because humans had a strange talent for noticing when 2 sides meant different things by the same words. None of these events were disasters. Each one, taken alone, was minor, forgettable, the kind of thing any organization might experience on an ordinary day, but I began keeping a private log of them, the same way Grace Hall had once kept her handwritten record of quiet fixes, because I suspected that somewhere down the line, these small numbers would begin to add up into something much larger. Ellen Cross reached out again, about a month after the withdrawal, this time through a longer, more personal message, rather than a brief report. She told me she had been reassigned to a new post, working alongside a Concord officer named Kalen, a quiet, thoughtful being from a species known for careful, methodical thinking. Kalen had apparently been the one to first raise concerns internally about the growing pattern of small delays and minor incidents following the human withdrawal. He asked me directly, Ellen wrote, whether the humans left behind any documentation explaining their unofficial procedures. I told him I did not know, and that even if such documentation existed, official policy would likely prevent its use, since it would represent uncredentialed modifications to approved systems. I read that message 3 times before setting it down. It confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. The Concord's own rules, built to ensure consistency and prevent unauthorized changes, were quietly working against them now, since every quiet fix we had left behind existed outside the boundaries those rules were designed to protect. I brought this to Henry Marsh directly, hoping he might have some plan, some quiet diplomatic path forward. Instead, he surprised me with a question of his own. "Do you remember why Counselor Vex gave for our exile?" he asked. "Destabilizing behavior," I said, ignoring risk calculations, choosing to save people the numbers said were acceptable losses. "And do you understand now what that actually meant?" I thought about it carefully before answering. It meant we refused to follow a system that treated people as numbers on a spreadsheet. Henry nodded. That refusal is also the exact reason their systems worked, as well as they did while we were there. We were never just following their designs. We were quietly correcting them, every single day, in ways too small and too numerous for any official record to ever fully capture. They removed the part of the system they saw as unpredictable, without understanding that the unpredictable part was also the part holding everything else together. I sat with that thought for a long time after our conversation ended. It was strange, in a way, to feel a kind of quiet vindication mixed with real concern for people I had once considered colleagues, even friends, despite the vote that sent us away. I did not want harm to come to anyone still living and working within Concord space, but I also understood, with growing certainty, that harm was already beginning to arrive, quietly, in small increments, exactly the way our own contributions had once arrived, unnoticed, in small increments of care. Laura Bennett continued tracking every report that reached us through unofficial channels, building what became an increasingly detailed picture of a system slowly losing the invisible scaffolding that had once supported it. She organized the reports by category: maintenance delays, communication errors, diplomatic misunderstandings, medical complications. Each category grew a little each week, never dramatically, never enough to trigger any large official investigation, but steadily, the way rust spread slowly across metal that used to be protected by a coat of paint nobody remembered applying. One evening, she brought her findings to my apartment, spreading printed pages across my kitchen table, though most of the actual data lived on her tablet. She looked exhausted, the kind of tiredness that came less from physical effort and more from carrying knowledge that felt heavier the longer she held it alone. "I keep thinking about all the people still there," she said. "The ones who never left, the smaller species who relied on us just as much as the Concord leadership pretended not to. They didn't vote for our exile. Most of them didn't have a vote at all. They're the ones absorbing all of this quietly, the same way we used to absorb their problems quietly, except now there's nobody there to catch things before they grow." I did not have a comforting answer for her that evening. I only had the same private log I had been keeping, filled with the same small, quiet warnings that none of us could yet act upon. A message arrived a few nights later that changed the shape of everything we had been tracking. It came not from Ellen Cross, nor from any of our usual quiet contacts, but from Kalen himself, the Concord officer Ellen had mentioned weeks earlier. He had somehow obtained a private communication channel, one that bypassed official Concord oversight entirely, and he addressed the message directly to me, by name. "I am aware," the message began, "that official policy forbids this contact. I am choosing to disregard that policy, because I believe the situation developing here requires honesty rather than procedure." He went on to describe, in careful, methodical detail, a growing pattern of small failures across multiple stations, remarkably similar to the ones Laura had already been tracking independently. He wrote that he had reviewed archived logs from before the exile and found repeated instances of manual corrections, unofficial safety overrides, and handwritten maintenance notes, all left behind by human personnel, none of which had been formally incorporated into current operating procedure. "I do not yet know what conclusion to draw from this," Kalen wrote. "I only know that the numbers no longer add up the way they once did, and I suspect the reason is not a coincidence." I read his message twice, then showed it to Henry Marsh the following morning. He read it in complete silence, his expression unreadable, before finally setting down the tablet and looking directly at me. "This is the first crack," he said quietly. "Not a scandal, not an accident large enough to make headlines. Just one careful, honest observer quietly noticing the truth before anyone with real power is willing to admit it." "What do we do?" I asked. Henry considered the question for a long moment. "We wait," he said finally, "not out of anger and not out of spite. We wait because the truth Kalen is beginning to see needs time to reach the people who actually have the power to act on it. Our silence, Daniel, is not simply an exit. It is a question we left behind, one the Concord will need to answer for themselves, in their own time, using their own eyes. I did not fully agree with him that day. Part of me wanted to reach out directly, to warn every station, every quiet colleague still serving faithfully within Concord territory, to tell them everything we already suspected before the small cracks became something larger. But I trusted Henry's years of careful judgment, and I understood, even then, that some lessons cannot be handed to people. They must be lived, slowly, painfully, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. I kept Kalen's message, and I began, quietly, to keep a second log alongside Laura's, one that recorded not just the small failures accumulating across Concord space, but the small, careful signs of understanding beginning to grow among a handful of individuals still willing to look honestly at what our absence had revealed. I did not know it yet, but that second log would matter more than either of us understood at the time. The message came in the middle of the night, and it was Laura Bennett who woke me, calling directly instead of sending a written note, which told me immediately that whatever had happened was serious. I answered before the second ring finished. "There's a fire," she said, her voice tight and controlled in the way people speak when they are forcing themselves not to panic. "On the same mining platform where Peter Voss used to work. It's spreading through the lower processing deck." I sat up immediately, pulling my tablet toward me, though I already knew there was little I could do from Earth except watch and wait for information to arrive. How bad? Bad enough that Ellen Cross broke protocol to contact me directly. She said the automated fire suppression system triggered late, and the containment doors on Deck 4 failed to seal in time because of a pressure calibration issue. I closed my eyes for a moment, because I understood immediately what she was describing. Peter Voss had once told me, back when he still worked that platform, that the containment door sensors on Deck 4 had a small known flaw, a slight delay in pressure reading caused by dust buildup in the old sensor housing. He used to clean those sensors manually every week, a task that appeared nowhere in his official duties, simply because he had noticed the flaw years earlier and decided it was easier to fix quietly than to fight through layers of approval to have it formally corrected. Nobody had cleaned those sensors since our withdrawal. Casualties? I asked, though I almost did not want to hear the answer. 3 confirmed so far, more unaccounted for. The evacuation is still ongoing. I sat there in the dark for a long moment, feeling something heavy settle into my chest, a mixture of grief and a terrible quiet anger that I did not know where to direct. I had spent weeks tracking small numbers, minor delays, forgettable inconveniences. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was people, real people, caught in a fire that a folded piece of paper in some ignored archive drawer might have prevented. I thought of Grace Hall's handwritten log, sitting somewhere in storage, unread. I thought of every quiet fix we had left behind, treated as unofficial noise rather than valuable knowledge, simply because it did not come stamped with the right kind of approval. Over the following days, more details reached us through the same unofficial channels. The fire had been contained within 6 hours, thanks largely to the desperate efforts of the platform's remaining crew, a mixed group of several Concord species working far beyond their usual training to manage a crisis their official procedures had never fully prepared them for. 7 people had died. Dozens more were injured, some severely. The official Concord report, when it was finally released publicly, described the incident as an unfortunate equipment failure, a rare and unpredictable malfunction, nothing more. Kalen contacted me again, 2 days after the official report was published, his message shorter than before, and colder, in the particular way that grief sometimes reads as coldness when translated across very different ways of feeling. "The report is false," he wrote. "Not false in its facts, but false in what it chooses not to say. I reviewed the maintenance history myself. There were 3 prior incidents involving that same sensor housing over the past 2 years, each one resolved quietly by human staff before it could become a formal problem. None of those resolutions were ever logged as required maintenance, because they were considered unofficial. When the humans left, the informal knowledge of that flaw left with them. Nobody remaining on staff knew to check it, because nobody remaining on staff had ever been told it existed. I read his words slowly, letting them settle. There it was, laid out plainly by someone who had no reason to lie to me, and every professional reason to stay quiet instead. The Concorde had not lost efficiency by removing humanity. They had lost an entire invisible layer of care, built quietly over years, that no official system had ever bothered to properly record. I brought Kalen's message to Henry Marsh immediately, expecting him to share my anger, or at least my grief. Instead, he read it with the same careful, unreadable expression he always wore when processing difficult news, and then he asked me something I did not expect. "Do you feel any satisfaction reading this?" he asked. The question startled me. "No," I said honestly. "Why would I?" "Because some people would," he said. "Some would say this proves we were right all along, that the Concorde deserves whatever consequences follow from casting us out. I need to know that you do not feel that way, Daniel, because the moment we start treating other people's suffering as proof of our own righteousness, we become exactly the kind of cold calculation the Concorde accused us of being in the first place." I sat with that for a long moment, and I understood that he was right to ask. It would have been easy, in that moment, to feel a bitter kind of vindication. It would have been much harder, and much more honest, to simply feel the loss for what it was, without turning it into a lesson aimed at anyone else's expense. "I don't feel satisfaction," I told him again. "I feel like we left people behind who trusted quiet fixes to keep them safe, and now they don't have that anymore, and it's costing them in ways they never agreed to." Henry nodded slowly. "Then hold on to that feeling. It is the only thing that will keep us honest, in whatever comes next." The mining platform fire was only the beginning of what Laura Bennett began calling, quietly, the reckoning of small things. Over the following month, the same pattern repeated itself across multiple locations within Concorde space, each incident slightly different in its details, but identical in its underlying cause. A supply ship missed a critical resupply window because the automated scheduling system failed to account for a docking bay malfunction that human ground crew had always manually corrected for, a workaround so routine that nobody had thought to document it as anything other than habit. A diplomatic summit between two rival trade factions collapsed into a lasting dispute after a translation nuance was missed. The same kind of subtle misunderstanding that a human mediator, trained through years of quiet trial and error, working between very different cultures, would once have caught within the first few sentences. None of these incidents, on their own, would have made headlines in any Concorde news channel. Each one was small enough to explain away individually, attributed to bad luck, equipment age, or unfortunate timing. But Laura's growing log told a different story when viewed as a whole. She built a simple chart, plotting the frequency of these small failures against the timeline of our withdrawal, and the pattern was unmistakable. The failures began almost immediately after our departure, and they had been steadily increasing ever since, not because Concorde systems were suddenly worse than before, but because the quiet, unofficial layer of human attention that had always caught these problems early was simply no longer there to catch them. I began to understand, during those weeks, that the true cost of our exile was not going to arrive as one single, dramatic catastrophe. It was going to arrive slowly, in exactly the same way our contributions had always arrived, quietly, in small pieces, easy to overlook individually, but impossible to ignore once someone finally added them all together. Ellen Cross reached out to me directly for the first time since the mining platform fire, several weeks later, her message carrying a different tone than anything she had sent before. She wrote that she had requested, and received, a formal reassignment away from her current post, citing personal reasons, though she admitted to me privately that the real reason was simply that she could no longer bear watching preventable problems accumulate without any official channel willing to acknowledge why they were happening. "I keep thinking about Grace," she wrote, referring to Grace Hall by name since the two of them had worked together briefly years earlier. She used to say that if she wrote everything down, at least there would be a record somewhere, even if nobody read it. I finally understand what she meant. Some of us are keeping our own quiet records now too, in case anyone ever asks why things fell apart the way they did. I forwarded her message to Grace directly, and Grace's response, when it came, was short, but heavy with meaning. "Tell her I'm sorry it took this," she wrote, "for anyone to understand why the record mattered." Kalen's messages grew more frequent as the weeks continued, and gradually his tone shifted from careful professional observation to something closer to open frustration. He described growing tension within the Concord's internal review boards, where a small but increasingly vocal group of officials had begun raising uncomfortable questions about the true cost of humanity's exile, questions that senior leadership seemed determined to avoid answering directly. Counselor Vex has refused 3 separate requests for a formal review of the withdrawal's operational impact, he wrote in one message. Her office maintains that any perceived increase in incidents is unrelated to the exile and instead reflects normal variation in a complex system. I do not believe this is a lie born from malice. I believe it is worse than that. I believe she genuinely does not understand what was lost, because the entire structure of your contribution was designed, by its very nature, to remain invisible. I thought about that phrase for a long time after reading it. Designed, by its very nature, to remain invisible. It was true, in a way I had never fully articulated before, even to myself. Humanity's care had never demanded credit. We fixed things quietly. We caught problems before they grew. We sat with the sick and the frightened without needing recognition for doing so, and in doing all of that so consistently, so completely without complaint, we had made ourselves impossible to properly measure. The Concord's own systems of evaluation, built entirely around visible, quantifiable metrics, had never been capable of recognizing the value of something that worked precisely because it refused to draw attention to itself. Henry Marsh called another meeting shortly after Kalen's message arrived, gathering the same small group of senior officials who had first convened after our exile. This time, the mood in the room felt different, heavier, weighted by the growing knowledge of real consequences accumulating far from home, consequences we could observe but not yet act upon. "We are approaching a decision point," Henry told the room. Kalen's messages, along with everything Laura has documented, suggest that the situation within Concord space is going to continue worsening before anyone with real authority is willing to admit why. At some point, and I believe that point is coming soon, someone within the Concord leadership will have to choose between continuing to deny the pattern or reaching out to ask for help. "And if they do reach out," Laura asked, "what do we say?" Henry looked around the room slowly before answering. "We say what we have always said, in one way or another, throughout our entire history working alongside the Concord. We say yes, because that is who we are. But we say it on our own terms this time, not as people asking to be let back in, but as people choosing, freely, to offer help to those who need it, regardless of whether they have earned it." I left that meeting carrying a strange mixture of feelings I could not fully separate from one another. Grief, for the lives already lost to preventable failures. A quiet, uncomfortable pride in finally seeing our own worth made undeniable, even at such a painful cost. And beneath both of those feelings, a growing sense of anticipation, because I understood, even then, that we were approaching a moment that would decide far more than the fate of a single diplomatic relationship. We were approaching the moment when the Concord would finally be forced to look directly at the empty space we had left behind and decide, for themselves, what that silence truly meant. The call that changed everything arrived on an ordinary afternoon while I was sitting in my garden trying, without much success, to think about anything other than Concord space. Henry Marsh himself contacted me directly, which he rarely did anymore, preferring to let Laura handle most of the daily coordination. His voice, when I answered, carried an urgency I had not heard from him since the day of our exile. "There's an outbreak," he said, without any greeting. A research station near the edge of Concord territory, studying a newly discovered organism from an unexplored moon. Something went wrong during containment. The illness is spreading through the station's crew, and early reports suggest it does not respond to any treatment currently available to Concord medical science. My chest tightened immediately. How many people? Just under 300, across mixed species. Kalen reached out directly to Ellen Cross, who reached out to Laura within the hour. He says the Concord Medical Board is treating this as a containment situation rather than a rescue situation. Their current plan is to seal the station entirely and monitor it from a distance, allowing the illness to run its course rather than risk further exposure by sending additional medical personnel inside. I understood immediately what that meant, even before Henry said it plainly. The Concord's careful mathematics had already made its decision. 300 lives, weighed against the theoretical risk of further contamination, had been judged an acceptable loss. They're going to let them die, I said quietly. That is their current plan, yes, Henry said. Unless something changes. I did not need to ask what he meant by that. I already understood, in that moment, exactly why he had called me directly, instead of routing the message through Laura's usual channels. This was not going to be handled through careful diplomatic notes and formal committee meetings. This was going to require people willing to move quickly, quietly, and without waiting for anyone's permission. Within 2 hours, Henry had assembled a small emergency group, gathered not through official government channels, but through the same quiet, trusted network that had carried information back and forth ever since our withdrawal. Among them was Dr. Nora Fields, a physician who had spent nearly a decade working in Concord medical facilities before the exile, treating patients from species whose biology bore little resemblance to our own. She arrived at the meeting already reviewing whatever preliminary data Kalen had managed to smuggle out through unofficial channels. The organism behaves unlike anything in the Concord's medical database, she said, scrolling through data on her tablet as she spoke. But it shares certain structural similarities with a pathogen we encountered on a joint research mission years ago, back before the exile. I remember the case. We developed an experimental treatment protocol at the time, one that was never formally adopted into Concord medical standards because it relied on techniques their systems considered too unpredictable for standardized use. Too unpredictable how? I asked. Because it required constant manual adjustment based on individual patient response, rather than a fixed dosage schedule. Concord protocol favors consistency and predictability above all else. Our old treatment approach required a physician to actually watch each patient closely and adjust accordingly, moment by moment, which their systems were never built to accommodate. I felt something settle in my chest, a strange, heavy recognition. Once again, the very quality that had led to our exile, our stubborn insistence on treating each situation individually rather than following a fixed formula, was exactly what stood between 300 people and a quiet, distant death sentence delivered through careful mathematics. Henry looked around the room at everyone gathered. "We are not going to wait for an official invitation," he said. Kalen has already confirmed that any request for outside assistance would take days to move through formal channels, time these people do not have. We are going to move directly, as private citizens offering aid, using whatever transport we can arrange quickly and quietly. "And if the Concorde refuses to let us dock?" someone asked. "Then we will have tried," Henry said simply. "But I do not believe they will refuse. Not when the alternative is watching 300 people die from a distance while a solution sits waiting just outside their door." I volunteered immediately to accompany the response team, along with Dr. Fields and a small crew of engineers and medical volunteers who had all served in Concord space before our withdrawal. Laura Bennett insisted on coming as well, arguing correctly that her ability to coordinate communication quickly and clearly would prove essential if things moved as fast as we expected them to. Our ship, a modest civilian medical transport rather than any official vessel, departed within 18 hours of Henry's first call, carrying Dr. Field's hastily reconstructed treatment protocol, a small stock of adaptable medical equipment, and a crew of people who had chosen, freely, to return to a place that had formally told them they were no longer welcome. The journey took just under 2 days, and during that time, Ellen Cross sent regular updates through Kaylin's quiet, unofficial channel. The situation aboard the research station was worsening steadily. Symptoms had progressed faster than the Concord Medical Board initially projected, and internal pressure was building among the station's remaining healthy crew members, who had begun openly questioning the decision to simply seal the station and wait. We arrived at the outer boundary of the quarantine zone to find a small fleet of Concord vessels maintaining a wide perimeter, monitoring the station from a careful, safe distance. Our arrival was noticed almost immediately, and within minutes, a formal communication reached us, demanding identification and purpose. Henry answered the call himself, his voice steady and calm. "This is a civilian medical vessel, carrying volunteer physicians and equipment. We are aware of the outbreak aboard the research station, and we are offering assistance, freely and without condition, to anyone willing to accept it." There was a long pause before the response came, and I understood, in that silence, that whoever was listening on the other end had likely never expected this particular scenario, humans arriving unasked, uninvited, offering exactly the kind of help their own calculations had already ruled unacceptable to attempt. The voice that eventually answered belonged to Counselor Vex herself. "You have no formal authorization to approach this station," she said. "We are aware," Henry replied. "We are not requesting authorization, we are requesting permission to help." "There is a difference, Counselor, and I believe you understand it." Another long pause followed, longer this time, and I found myself holding my breath, uncertain whether we were about to be turned away entirely, forced to watch from a distance exactly the way the Concord itself had chosen to do. Finally, Vex spoke again, her voice carrying something I had not heard from her before, a careful, measured uncertainty that felt entirely unfamiliar, coming from someone who had always projected complete confidence in every decision she made. "Dr. Field's treatment protocol was never formally approved," she said. "If you proceed, and the outcome is unfavorable, the Concord bears no responsibility for the result." "Understood," Dr. Field said, stepping forward to answer directly. "We are not asking the Concord to bear responsibility. We are asking for the chance to try, because we believe waiting will cost more lives than acting will." The silence that followed felt like it stretched far longer than it actually did. Then, finally, Vex gave the order to allow our vessel through the perimeter. What followed was the most demanding 40 hours I had experienced since long before our exile. Dr. Fields worked alongside a small team of Concord medical staff still stationed aboard the research platform, adjusting treatment protocols moment by moment, exactly as she had described, watching each patient's individual response rather than relying on any fixed formula. I spent much of that time simply assisting wherever needed, carrying supplies, monitoring equipment, sitting beside patients too frightened to be left completely alone, holding hands, claws, and unfamiliar limbs alike, offering whatever quiet comfort I could provide. Kaylin arrived aboard the station partway through our efforts, having requested and received formal permission to observe directly. He watched Dr. Fields work for a long while, in complete silence, before finally speaking to me quietly, off to one side of the crowded medical bay. "I do not think I fully understood, until this moment, what your presence actually meant," he said. "I read the reports, I saw the numbers, but watching this, watching someone adjust their entire approach moment by moment, based on nothing but careful, patient attention, I finally understand why your methods never fit neatly into our systems. They were never meant to be systems at all. They were simply care, applied consistently, without needing a formula to justify it." I did not have a perfect answer for him in that moment, only the simple truth of it. "We never thought of it as anything special," I told him. "It just seemed like the obvious thing to do whenever someone needed help." By the end of the second day, the outbreak had been brought fully under control. Not every patient survived, and I will not pretend otherwise, because doing so would dishonor those we lost. But of the nearly 300 people aboard that station, more than 260 recovered fully, a number far higher than the Concorde's own projections had ever predicted, back when their calculations had judged the situation an acceptable loss. Counselor Vex visited the station in person once the crisis had passed, and I happened to be present when she encountered Henry Marsh in one of the quiet observation decks overlooking the recovering patients below. "You did not have to come," she told him. "No," Henry agreed. "We did not have to. We chose to, because that has always been the difference between what your systems calculate and what we simply do." Vex was quiet for a long moment, watching the recovering patients through the observation window before finally speaking again, her voice carrying a weight I had never heard from her before. "I do not yet know what to do with what I have witnessed here," she admitted. "But I no longer believe the decision to remove you from Concorde space was as simple as we once claimed it to be." Henry nodded slowly, offering no triumph in his expression, only a quiet, steady patience. "That is a good place to begin," he said. "But it is only a beginning, counselor. What comes next is entirely up to you." We returned home 3 days later, and I expected, in some quiet corner of my mind, that our arrival would feel like a kind of victory. It did not. It felt instead like the closing of one chapter and the uncertain opening of another, one whose shape none of us could yet predict. Dr. Nora Fields returned to her usual quiet medical practice almost immediately, saying little about what had happened, though I noticed she kept a small printed copy of the treatment protocol she had reconstructed, folded carefully inside her coat pocket, as though she wanted it close at hand in case it was ever needed again. Laura Bennett resumed her usual work coordinating communication, though the nature of that work had shifted considerably. Where once she had spent her days tracking small failures accumulating quietly across Concorde space, she now found herself managing a growing stream of messages, no longer smuggled quietly through unofficial channels, but arriving instead through increasingly open, formal requests for contact. Word of what had happened aboard the research station had spread quickly, first through informal accounts passed between Concorde officials, and then, within weeks, through official channels as well, since a story involving nearly 300 lives saved proved impossible to keep entirely quiet, even for an organization as careful with its narratives as the Concorde. Kalen became, in many ways, the quiet center of what followed. He had witnessed the crisis firsthand, and his careful, methodical reports, submitted through proper internal channels rather than any unofficial route, carried a weight that personal testimony alone could never have achieved. He documented, in exacting detail, every place where the absence of humanity's informal care had contributed to the crisis in the first place, and every place where its return had directly prevented further loss of life. His reports did not argue for humanity's return through emotional appeal. They simply laid out the evidence, plainly, the way careful evidence should be laid out, and allowed the conclusion to speak for itself. Ellen Cross remained in contact with us throughout this period, though her tone in each message grew steadily lighter, less burdened by the quiet grief that had colored so much of our earlier correspondence. She wrote to me one evening, several weeks after our return, describing a formal internal review the Concorde had finally authorized, examining the full operational impact of humanity's withdrawal across every affected station and territory. "They are calling it the Continuity Review," she wrote. "It is the first time anyone with real authority has agreed to look honestly at everything that changed after your departure, rather than dismissing each incident individually as unrelated coincidence. Kalen has been asked to lead the technical portion of the assessment." I read her message with a strange mixture of vindication and quiet sadness, because I understood that this review, however overdue, would ultimately confirm everything we had already known for months, at a cost measured in real lives that could never be recovered simply by acknowledging the truth after the fact. The formal results of the Continuity Review arrived roughly 2 months after our return from the research station, delivered not through any dramatic announcement, but through a lengthy, carefully documented report distributed to every member species of the Concord Assembly. I read the full document myself, and even accounting for the careful, measured language typical of Concord bureaucracy, its conclusions were unmistakable. The report documented, in exhaustive detail, the steady increase in operational failures across every category Laura had once tracked independently through unofficial channels. It confirmed, explicitly, that a significant portion of these failures traced directly back to the loss of informal, unofficial contributions previously provided by human personnel, contributions that had never been properly recorded or valued within the Concord's existing systems of measurement. The report did not apologize. Councillor Vex, whatever private uncertainty she had expressed to Henry Marsh aboard the research station, remained far too careful a political figure to offer anything resembling a public admission of fault. But the report's conclusions spoke plainly enough, even without an apology attached, and within Concord space, word of its findings spread quickly among the smaller member species who had felt the absence most directly, the ones who had never had a vote in our exile in the first place, yet had absorbed nearly all of its consequences. It was roughly 3 weeks after the report's release that a formal Concord envoy arrived on Earth, requesting a private audience with Henry Marsh. I was present for that meeting, along with Laura Bennett, at Henry's specific request. The envoy turned out to be Kalen himself, traveling not as a representative of any political faction within the Concord, but as an individual delegate, formally authorized to speak on behalf of a growing coalition of member species who had requested this meeting independently of Councillor Vex's central leadership. Kalen entered the meeting room, carrying none of the formal ceremony I had expected from someone representing the Concord. He simply sat across from Henry, folded his hands carefully, and spoke with the same quiet, methodical honesty that had characterized every message he had ever sent me. "I am not here to ask you to return," he said. "I understand from everything I have witnessed that such a request would be inappropriate, given everything that has happened. I am here instead to ask a different question, one I believe the Concord as a whole has never properly asked, not before your exile, and not during the many years you served among us before that." "What question is that?" Henry asked. "Why?" Kalen said simply. "Why were you willing to do what you did, consistently, for so many years, without ever demanding recognition for it? Why choose to quietly fix flaws in systems that were never yours to fix, sit beside strangers whose suffering could never be measured by any of our official metrics, and offer help even now, to people who had just formally told you that you were no longer welcome among them? I do not ask this as an accusation. I ask because I genuinely do not understand, and I believe understanding this is the only path toward ensuring nothing like what happened at that research station ever happens again." Henry was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the bitterness I might have expected, given everything we had all witnessed over the preceding months. "We never separated caring from doing," Henry said. "Your systems, from what I have observed over many years working alongside the Concord, tend to treat compassion as something separate from function, a pleasant addition to an otherwise efficient process, rather than something essential to making that process actually work. We never saw it that way. To us, noticing a flaw and fixing it quietly was simply part of doing the job properly. Sitting beside someone who was frightened was simply part of caring for a patient properly. We did not require permission to do these things, because we never saw them as separate from the basic responsibility of showing up and doing good work." Kalen absorbed this in silence for a long moment. "And the exile," he said finally. "Do you believe it was deserved?" Henry considered the question carefully. "I believe your assembly voted based on the information and values available to it at the time," he said. "I do not believe the vote was made out of cruelty. I believe it was made out of a genuine, if flawed, desire for consistency and predictability, values your systems have always prized highly. I do not think your assembly understood, at the time of that vote, exactly what they were choosing to remove. I believe they understand it somewhat better now." And if the Assembly were to reverse its decision, Kalen asked, would humanity return to Concord space? This was the question I had been waiting for since Kalen first arrived, and I watched Henry closely as he considered his answer. He did not rush it. He took his time, exactly the way he always did, allowing the full weight of the question to settle before responding. We are not interested in returning to a system that only values us once it has been forced to recognize our worth through loss, Henry said finally. If the Concord wishes humanity to serve within its territory again, that invitation must come from genuine understanding, not desperation, and it must come with real changes to how the Concord measures and values the kind of quiet, unofficial contributions that were never properly recognized before. We are not asking to be let back in, Kalen. We are asking whether the Concord is finally willing to become the kind of place worth returning to. Kalen nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had come to know him, however distantly, through months of careful written correspondence, I saw something that looked very much like genuine respect settle into his expression. I will carry that message back exactly as you have given it, he said. I believe it is the only honest answer that could have been given, and I suspect the coalition that sent me here will understand that as well. The months that followed brought slow, careful changes within Concord space, changes that came not through any single dramatic reform, but through the same kind of gradual, patient accumulation that had once characterized humanity's quiet contributions in the first place. The continuity review led to the formal establishment of new evaluation standards, designed specifically to recognize and properly value informal contributions previously dismissed as unofficial noise. Smaller member species, emboldened by the coalition Kalen represented, began pushing for greater voice within the Assembly, arguing that decisions affecting the entire Concord should never again be made without proper consideration for those who lacked formal voting power but bore the heaviest consequences of decisions made above them. Grace Hall's handwritten log, the one she had assumed would sit forgotten in some archive drawer, was eventually located and formally incorporated into updated maintenance documentation across every station where she had once served. Peter Voss's corrected schematics received the same treatment, finally recognized as valuable technical knowledge rather than unauthorized deviation from approved design. Small things, in the grand scope of an entire assembly's structure, but meaningful ones, proof that the quiet record-keeping so many of us had maintained, without any expectation that it would ever be read, had mattered after all. I do not know, even now, whether humanity will ever formally return to serve within Concord space in the way we once did. Henry Marsh maintains regular contact with Kalen and the coalition he represents, and slow, careful negotiations continue, built this time on mutual understanding rather than one-sided need. I suspect, whatever the eventual outcome, that the relationship between our two peoples will never again look quite the way it did before our exile, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. I think often about that final moment before we left Concord space, standing before Counselor Vex on the boarding ramp, offering her a single quiet sentence instead of the argument I could have made instead. We'll leave the lights on the way we found them. I did not fully understand, at the time, how much weight that simple promise would eventually carry. We kept every light burning exactly as we said we would. We left behind every quiet fix, every careful note, every small piece of unofficial care, freely, without demanding recognition for any of it. And in the silence that followed our departure, in every small failure that slowly accumulated across a system that had once run smoothly on care nobody ever properly measured, the Concord finally heard something they had never managed to hear while we were still there quietly working beside them. They heard exactly how loudly an absence can speak, once the silence grows long enough for anyone to finally notice what it left behind. We never left because we stopped caring. We left because they asked us to stop, and it took the weight of that silence, measured in real consequences none of us ever wanted, for anyone to finally understand what that silence had cost them.